Welcome to another of my podcasts where I get to chat to inspirational people, people I've known for quite a while. And tonight is no exception. And I'm very pleased to have with me Amy Marder. Amy is somebody I've known since I was a student again. Unfortunately, when I did my great trip to America as a student, I didn't get to stay with Amy and see what she was up to, although she was on my list. And I have the confession to make that I had booked in to spend some time seeing cases with Amy after spending time with Kathy Hout, and somehow managed to completely screw up my flights. And I phoned her from Kathy's at Cornell and said, "Oh, my flight's been changed. I can't make it." Well, actually, that was not totally true. In fact, it was totally false. I had just completely screwed up on my dates, and I'm so sorry. But I did get to meet you later on, and it's always lovely to see you whenever we get the chance to catch up. So welcome, Amy.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, it's lovely to have you, and it's lovely to have you back here again. Those people who listen to the site will know that we had technical problems last time, and it was all sorts of technical problems. Not only did we have problems with the internet, but Amy had a backup copy and then unfortunately spilled a drink on her keyboard, and that was the end of that. So several weeks late, we're meeting up again. So perhaps, you know, there are going to be some of the same questions and things that we'll chat about, but it may not be quite so spontaneous. For those of you that don't know Amy, Amy is an inspirational character in lots of ways. And even though I've known her since the 80s, she doesn't seem to have aged since then.
Oh, thank you.
You really are. And she was the first person to do a veterinary residency in veterinary behaviour under Vicky Voith, who I've done previous podcasts with, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But she was also a pioneer in the field of human-animal interactions. She wrote an article very early on in 1985 in a special edition of the Vet Clinics of North America that I wasn't actually aware of until relatively recently. But it's very interesting because I actually just pulled it up, and it said it's human companion animal relationships and animal behavior problems. And I love this bit in it. On the abstract, the compatibility of social systems of humans and companion animals has facilitated the formation of a unique interspecific relationship. Some of the most common behavior problems that people have with their pets are a result of the type of relationship that is formed between them. In most cases, neither pet nor owner is exhibiting abnormal behavior. Rather, they are demonstrating normal species typical behaviors that are unacceptable to the other species. And that actually has really been my mantra through the whole of my professional life. And I guess I probably did read it when it came out in 1985 or sometime after that, because I'd read most of those articles, but I don't recall reading it, I must confess. But I think you've probably had enormous influence on me without me realizing. The other thing that Amy does an awful lot of, or is inspiration and pioneering, is her work with shelter animals. And we'll get to chat about that. She's done a lot of work also with fatal dog attacks, having published an article where they reviewed over 250 fatal dog attacks. And there is a podcast that, in between the first take of this chat tonight and tonight, I've done a podcast with Jim Crosby, who's doing his PhD in that. And I know he's been accessing some of Gary Patronek's records from that early case. That case series, which so we've got lots to chat about. Other articles that I remember, sort of again a vet clinics article, one on drugs, which the use of drugs in managing behavior problems, one of the first articles that I read on the topic. So awful lot of inspiration, and so as I said, let's get chatting, shall we? And as I said, thank you for joining me again. And as I say, we hope this time that it's going to work and that we get a smooth run through. So
far, so good.
So far, so good. Yeah, that's good. Yeah. I haven't spilt my drinks. I'm going to move my keyboard out of the way because I don't need it. So where should we begin? Should we start with, well, let's start with the obvious question. Why did you what attracted you to working in behaviour, and how did you end up doing a residency with Vicky?
As an undergraduate at the University of Pennsylvania, I got very interested in behavior. I had a wonderful professor, uh, and his graduate student, who has recently passed away, was Penny Bernstein. I'm not sure if you know the name.
Yeah, I know.
And she and Dr. John Smith were such wonderful mentors, and I fell in love with behavior, and as working with them, as I worked with them.
At undergraduate level, what were they teaching you about behavior? Were they teaching you anything about companion animals?
Mostly observation. Nothing about companion animals.
Yeah.
It was a lot of work at the zoo, watching. They taught me how to watch animals, observe animals, and describe what the animals were doing. And that's what I did as an undergraduate. So, and my father was a pediatrician, so he was in favor of me going to a medical type of school after graduation rather than getting my PhD in behavior. So I decided, since I was and am an animal lover, I decided to go to vet school thinking, and they said to me, well, there would be behavior courses for you to take. And there were a couple, maybe 3 behavior courses way back then. This was in 1975,
Wow.
There were behavior courses at the University of Pennsylvania. So, but not extensive, but very good behaviorists. And then as I was in vet school, I got kind of interested in medicine and was interested in ophthalmology. And so I decided after graduation, to do a regular internship in medicine and surgery. And as I was doing that internship, I was still interested in behavior, so I did a lot of dog training. I learned how to be a dog trainer, and I was out in California, so I learned how to be a dog trainer. And I worked very early on with Ian Dunbar, who you had on, was starting to do kind dog training. When previously we were using choke chains and we're still doing it, choke chains and pinch collars, and taking dogs that were digging in the yard and taking their heads and sticking them in a bucket of water. And so in Southern California, there was a woman with Ian Dunbar that started the Ethical Dog Training Club or association or whatever. So I learned about ethical dog training. And then after I was in California for 4 years, I said, I want to go back to school, and I want to learn more about medicine, and I want to learn about behavior. And at the same time as I was thinking about this, Victoria Voith was. And Victoria Voith started the first residency ever at my alma mater at the University of Pennsylvania. So I ended up going back to Philadelphia. So
there it is. And
that's it.
And you never did do the PhD, but you did something far more useful.
I never did it, yeah. And they really wanted me to do a PhD, and I never did the PhD. And I'm sorry now that I didn't.
Oh.
So, yeah.
So what was it like?
I love research. It would have.
Yeah, well, you've done some great papers. We'll talk about in a little while. But so what was it like, though, in those early days? Because even now, if you say you're doing a residency in veterinary behavior, people sometimes look at you as if you've got 2 heads, or they say sort of, well, don't you miss being a real vet? And I thought, this is being a real vet. I mean, what was it like? Because in those early days, I mean, certainly chatting with Vicky Voice, you were very much feeling your way. So, I mean, how did the residency go? What was it? Was it all behaviour? You have to do, or yeah, presume you had to do courses in neurology as well, did you? Or?
I did some neurology. It was a very unusual behavior residency, and that's thanks to Victoria Voith. I did take courses with the medical school residents, so I learned that's where I started my whole interest in drug therapy, because I went to their rounds all the time, and we learned about drugs that were used in people, and then I also learned how to do research. So I learned how to critique journal articles and to set up research projects, and of course I did neurology rotations during my residency, but I think the most important, my background was in the observation of behavior, and so I started to observe companion animals, and with the help of Victoria, who also was trained in basic behavior research. So it was well, as well as learning theory. So I also took courses in learning theory, and certainly which had to do with dog training. And Victoria Voith was the first person that applied the behavior modification principles to animals. So we started to do that during my residency.
That's something we chatted about when I did the podcast with her, that, you know, I just don't think people realize just what Vicky brought to the field, you know, that
yes,
sort of discipline of, this is how these protocols actually work. And even though she's still in academia, I mean, I'm so glad she did one of these podcasts, because in fact, I was chatting to the students about it, and they sort of looked at me when I mentioned Victoria Voith and thinking, just assuming that they would know who she was. And it's like, right, okay. It's surprising. And as I said, she really should be given the credit. I don't suppose you can remember what the first research project you did was, by any chance, can you?
Probably the first research project I did was the use of Valium for spraying in cats.
Okay.
And certainly we had, spraying is a big problem, right? Urine marking is a big problem in cats. And I'm not sure, you know, if I worked my brain really hard, why did I decide to use Valium for treatment for urine spraying in cats? Now, of course, more recently we found that Valium is not a very safe drug to give to cats, but way back then we didn't know anything about that. And why did I want to use, you know, an anti-anxiety drug? It probably had something to do with my rounds with the human residents, because the man that was responsible for the use of Valium in people, Rickliffs, headed many of our rounds, and it probably was influenced by him, by saying, hey, I want to reduce anxiety in cats. Maybe this is why they're spraying. You know, they spray when they're waiting to eat. They spray when they go outside and they're interacting with other cats. So what if we reduce their anxiety? Will that reduce the spraying? Mm-hmm. And so that was probably my first research project.
I think that's a really interesting. That's a really interesting point, because, yeah, you know, somebody has to make that leap and say, well, I think that, you know, these cats are anxious and yeah, therefore these are the drugs that we want to be turning our attention to.
Right, yeah.
Interestingly, I mean, in recent years, I've tended to shift away from the idea that spraying cats are anxious and tend to think of them as more
Right.
frustrated. But again, the benzodiazepines can work in that because they,
Mm-hmm.
increase inhibition from that. And we do have
Mm-hmm.
something in common. I think we're the only two people who've done long-term follow-ups on house soiling cats. You did yours on the litter
Oh,
tray,
yes.
and I did
Yes.
mine on the spraying cats. Um,
Uh-huh.
and yeah, so and we both had good success rates, which is nice.
Yes.
Interestingly, with ours, when we did our study and we looked at the pheromone treatments in the long term, most people had got a really significant reduction in the short term, and they were given free product for the long term. And
Mm-hmm.
very few of them actually bothered to keep it. And it always struck me as strange that they knew they could get much less soiling in the house. They had free product to allow them to do it, but they just thought that the trade-off was sort of such that, well, if I have to put the fell-away spray, as it was in those days, rather than the diffuser each day, I'd rather have the cat spraying in the house. I just find that really weird that, that,
Oh,
that people are tolerant of it at a certain level, and that
well,
trade-off in effort.
if you've ever done house calls for cats that are spraying,
Mm, yeah.
and you go into the house and you can't breathe,
Mm,
the stench is so powerful, and they don't seem to notice it.
yeah.
I
It,
think they just get used to it. So, and it could be that as we live with these odors, that we're
yeah.
not bothered by them
Yeah.
in long term. So yeah, so it's better to live with the spray
Yeah.
than to spray. We were just spraying the original feel away on the walls, right?
Yeah.
And yeah,
But I
so
mean, yeah, a lot of them just thought, well, they were still happy, but they were happy sort of with spraying, 2 or 3 sprays, a, a week. And I was thinking,
mhm.
not sure I would want that. But it did bring home to me that important point that managing a problem is managing the problem for the owner. It's not setting your
Right,
standards, So
absolutely,
that is a
yes.
success because they were happy. And that's a big challenge I think that we have in this field,
Hmm.
is that if you're in any other field of medicine, then you want to see the thing completely resolved, whereas
Hmm.
here it's very much, well, is the owner happy at this point? And it sort of touches on what I was saying earlier about the human animal relationship, and every single relationship is unique. I spent much of this weekend actually writing lectures on that for my
Hmm.
students. But it's that uniqueness in the relationship, and who are we to judge what standards they should set as far as what they're willing to tolerate. And as you say in that article in 1985, that these are normal behaviors,
It's
and
what they're willing to tolerate.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's whether they think it's acceptable or not.
I
So
remember one of the research projects I did was behavior problems after adoption, and the number one problem after adoption was this is in dogs, was house soiling. And so I one of the questions I said is your dog house trained? And and then the next question was, well, how many times does your dog urinate in the house? And and they would say the dog urinates in the house 2 to 3 times a week, but he's house trained,
yeah,
right? They considered that house trained, and I'm saying, oh my God, if my dog urinated in the house 2 or 3 times a week, I'd, I would
yeah.
be a little bit beside myself. But no, these people said, no, that's good, that's fine. 2 to 3 times a week, I can live with that. So
Yeah, no, it's absolutely. Well, that's a really nice. You've done a beautiful segue there into the next topic, which is, and you mentioned about adoption. And again, you're a pioneer in sort of working with shelters to try and manage some of the problem behavior there. So, how did that come about? How did you end up, focusing on that area?
after I finished my residency, uh, of course, I needed to make money. So not only was I a regular veterinarian, but I also I set up a behavior practice where I saw owned animals with behavior problems. And one of the things that Victoria Voith taught me was to ask people how serious they thought the problem was. And I would say, is it not serious, middle serious, very serious? And have you ever considered getting rid of your animal because of the behavior problem? And I would say 99.9% of the people would say the problem is very serious, but I would never consider getting rid of my animal because he's a member of the family. It's once you get an animal, you are devoted to keeping that animal. So my behavior clients, they weren't putting their animal to sleep. And even though we were giving lectures saying that we're saving animals' lives, yeah, I've saved an animal life just by saying I can help you with a behavior problem. Not uh, not really. We're not really preventing euthanasia in that in that population of people. They they by themselves were preventing euthanasia, not because of what I was doing. So then I was asked to help out in the shelter, and the shelter was flooded with animals with the same behavior problems as the animals that I saw in private practice, but they didn't have those owners to stand by and say, I want to keep you. I want to keep you and I want to help you get through this behavior problem. So I said, my God, these are the animals that need help. This is where I can influence euthanasia by working with shelter animals. Same behavior problems, same animals. So just different people. So
And again,
yeah,
yeah, different relationships, and yeah, seen in a completely
right.
different light. So where did you start
Yes.
off? Did you start off at the ASPCA, or did you start off at a small shelter?
No, I wanted to start off at the MSPCA. That's the Massachusetts Society for the Prevention of Cruelty. So I applied. They were hiring a shelter veterinarian. And now that was at the time, but there weren't any shelter veterinarians. So I said, whoops, something's buzzing. So I said, well, I applied for the job as a shelter veterinarian. I'm going, I know medicine. I can do shelter work, right? I know about feline respiratory illnesses and I know about kennel cough and I could probably work in medicine in the shelter, but I could also do behavior in the shelter. So the the president of the MSPCA, he said to me, "Do you know anything about sanitation?" And I said, "Oh, what I don't know, I could learn." And then he said, I know you're very interested in behavior. And I said, yes, I'm interested in behavior. And he said, but I think I'd rather have a person in this job that is more experienced in sanitation than in behavior. So they didn't hire me because I didn't know enough about sanitation. So anyway,
They're
and they
lost.
did hire, yeah, well then I I went to many behavior conferences and I was sitting in, and I still wanted to work with behavior in the shelter, right? So I was sitting, I remember this, in the back seat of Steve Zawistowski's car, and I was talking to someone about what I wanted to do with behavior. And he's sitting in the front seat and he said, Amy, would you ever consider doing this at the ASPCA in New York? And I said, oh my God, that's my home. You know, New York is my home. Uh, and I said, yes, I would consider it. So a year later, I was hired. So that was really my first place was the A.
So what was it
I worked a
like?
little bit with shelters. Oh my God, it was an amazing place. Amazing. Well, Steve had his PhD in behavior, and under him, he had PhDs in education and a clinical psychologist with a PhD. So it was the perfect place for me to start my research.
So what
And
year are we talking about here?
oh,
About
1999.
okay,
So
yeah.
yeah, so It was a long time ago, but it was where I was given permission to observe the animals, to do shelter rounds. Whoever did shelter rounds before, and so I could observe the behavior. We could do medicine. There was a large shelter medicine uh, 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 group of people that looked at health, but no one was looking at behavioral health. Steve was interested in it, but he didn't work within the shelter. So there I was. They gave me 3 dog trainers, administrative assistant. I was able to put together research projects at the A shelter. We did great research projects. So,
you remember what your first one was there?
my first one there. Well, I've always been interested in behavior evaluation, so it would probably had something to do with the behavior evaluation. And were there things that the animals did in the shelter? I set up the dogs weren't walked when I started working at the A. So we started having volunteers walk the dogs. And what we learned about the individual dogs, then we tried to take what we learned and use it to predict their behavior after adoption. So that was probably, I did so much research with observing behavior and how predictive was it. I also did a research project with a graduate student on whether beds reduce dogs' anxiety. If the dog had a bed in their kennel, were they less anxious? And guess what? We found out, yes.
Mm.
So they were less anxious. So, and what else did we do? It was a long time ago, but most of it was done on behavior evaluations, but also on enrichment, on what we could. I always thought that how can we make the shelter environment as close to a home environment as possible? Now, certainly, I thought that the big difference in the shelter environment and the home environment was the existence of a person that cared about the dog. And so I assigned volunteers to certain dogs, so they had a person to form a bond with. So that was another little project that I did. So
Enormously important.
enormous, but no one ever said that before. These animals were locked up in cages, and there was a woman that I used to, since I didn't have a life when I worked at the A except for the A, and so she worked in the evenings, and she would take the dogs out of the kennels and put them in this not huge, it was a big room, and I think it was the ex-library, and she let the dogs play with each other. That was probably the first play group ever out of a shelter. And so I would go watch those dogs play every night. So when she was working there, and it was remarkable. So that was another enrichment thing that we did. So it was a remarkable place. And it still is in many ways, but way back then it was remarkable, and Steve Z allowed it to be remarkable. Then he wasn't my boss after I don't know how long they took him away. I think they thought we would be trouble if we worked together. So.
But again, it's that sort of, I really like the fact that you say when you started off, you're interested in watching behavior. And again, that I think is probably where my enthusiasm comes from as well. And
yes. You learn so much just by watching.
Yeah, I mean, I'm the youngest of 5 kids, and my 2 brothers were born first. They played with each other. Then the next 2 years, my 2 sisters came along. Then there was a short gap, and I turned up. I had nobody to play with. I tended to play with the dog, but and I think it probably did make me a big watcher. I was on the side, and too often people just sort of rush in and just taking that time to look. And I was chatting with my wife actually earlier today, because she likes her horses, and we're just saying there's so much you could you can do with a horse without getting on its back.
Right.
And if only people, a little bit like you have to do a theory test before you do your driving test. We ought to insist that people have to, in a case of a horse, they have to be able to work a horse from the ground before they get on a horse's back. And likewise, and I think in Switzerland, they actually do have they used to have a theory exam. They dropped it, unfortunately. But you used to have to pass a test in order to, I think, to own a dog. And it shouldn't be based on theory, when do dogs come into season or anything like that. It should actually be based on, what do you observe? When you watch your dog, what do you see? And I just think, people can gain so much just spending that quality time watching. And it's a lot of fun as well. You see your dog playing with others. I think a lot of people don't even know what play looks like in their dogs.
Exactly. Well, they don't. Yeah.
They get worried. They think, oh my God, my dog's going to attack someone. No, he's running up to have a good time.
Right. Yes.
I think, dogs are amazing. I think there's not another species on the planet that can meet a complete stranger and within a few seconds be rolling around on the floor with them having fun. If we did that, we'd get arrested. But dogs do that. And that's one of the great things about them. And you mentioned the research that you did, and there's a really nice study of yours that I like, which is the one about the Foodball aggression.
Yes.
And the prediction of the test. Can we just talk about that a little bit? Because
sure. So,
whilst you and I both know it, I think people listening, if they're not familiar with it, it'd be really, good of them, because it expands that bigger issue also about testing. And you mentioned earlier that, actually most of your assessments was from people walking the dogs and handling the dogs, as opposed to doing specific tests, which have come in for a lot of criticism. What does a test in a shelter tell you about how the dog is going to be like in a real home? And we'll come back to that. But let's talk about the Foodball testing and the food guarding.
Sure. I would say the aggression over food was always an interest to me, knowing that most dogs are not aggressive over food. And is it something genetic? It's just that's the kind of dog they are. But some dogs are aggressive over food. And so in the shelter, years before I started my shelter work, I did a small study on owned animals, and just looking at the prevalence of foodball aggression over the foodball, and then when I started working at the A and looking at the frequency of aggression over food, and just again looking at the variability of the existence of foodball aggression, and then wondering, since we were looking at the predictability of certain behaviors in the shelter and after the shelter, I said, well, an easy thing to do would be to look at the predictability of foodball aggression, because it's an easy behavior to elicit when the dog is in the shelter, and then after adoption, if it is elicited after adoption. So we put together, when I left the A and I left New York and I came back to Massachusetts, and I took a position at the Animal Rescue League of Boston. And thanks to our very accomplished president, he got us a $3 million grant to start a center, what we called the Center for Sheltered Dogs. And this was a center that was researching shelter dogs so that we learned more about what shelter dogs did and how we could help save shelter dogs' lives. So my project was going to be looking at foodball aggression as it existed in the shelter and then following up on these dogs after adoption and see if the foodball aggression still existed after adoption. So that was the whole concept of this study. And it was amazing to me, the results of this study, because I knew that dogs in the shelter were really stressed, right? I knew that. They exhibit all kinds of stress behaviors. We did cortisol levels. Hennessy did cortisol levels. So we know that the dogs in the shelter are stressed. You can just look at them and see how stressed they are. But how does that stress levels affect their behavior? So this foodball aggression test showed us that there was right now, I can't remember the exact numbers of foodball aggression in the shelter that we tested, and that was whether the dog showed his teeth, growled, lunged, snapped, or bit this rubber hand that we tested out with in the shelter when we did the foodball aggression test. And then after adoption, did the dog show any kind of foodball aggression to his owners? We didn't have the owners take a rubber hand out, but we asked the owners not to bother the dog when the dog was eating, but most of the owners did bother the dog when it was eating. So so what we found out is that just about half the dogs that showed foodball aggression in the shelter did not show foodball aggression in the home after adoption. And then the dogs that did not show foodball aggression in the shelter, a number of them did show foodball aggression after adoption. So
around a quarter. If people wondering what I was doing, I was actually pulling up the paper because I couldn't remember the figures.
So get the numbers.
So it's 55%
yes.
that were positive went on to be positive in the home.
Right.
And 22% of them that had been negative went on to be aggressive.
Exactly.
So basically, if they were aggressive on the exercise, it was a 50-50 chance pretty much as to whether or not, and if they weren't, well, there was still a 1 in 4 chance that they might end up like that. And again, I think it's a really stunning finding, I think.
And when I started out doing this, many shelters were just putting dogs that were aggressive over the foodball to sleep.
Mm.
And as a result of this study, after I did this study, the Emily Weiss at the ASPCA also looked at foodball aggression in shelter dogs and after adoption and found results that agreed with my results. And then what we said, after I finished the study, I lectured at the Denver Dumb Friends League, which is a large shelter in Denver, and the manager of the shelter said, well, I'm not going to do foodball aggression tests anymore. I'm just going to adopt the dogs out, not knowing whether they're food aggressive. And I said, well, if you do that, you've got to tell me if any of the dogs bite people. So he did. He stopped doing all the food tests and then followed up on the dogs and looked at bite numbers, and there was no increase in bite numbers. There was also no increase in dogs returned. And I said, oh my God, this was fantastic. And then Emily Weiss expanded on that and looked at 9 shelters across the United States, and they stopped their foodball aggression tests and found the same thing. No increase in bites and no increase in returns.
And again, I think that's so important because people say, well, we ought to be doing these things because of the liability. I have a former PhD student, and she's from America, Karen Griffin, and we're just in the process actually of writing up the first sort of substantial paper from her PhD. And I'll give a plug to Maddie's foundation, because they sponsor a lot of research on dog welfare in the US. They don't sponsor outside the US, and her work was all done in the UK. And what she did is this paper is very much focused on all the protocols that shelters do. And she wrote out to all of the members of the Association of Dogs and Cats Homes and said, what do you do by way of screening? What are the criteria you use that might disqualify somebody from taking on a dog? And she went and brought all this information together, and then first of all arranged it into a number of different themes and how important these were. So as I said, it could be, for some shelters they would say that would disqualify you if you had kids, you know, or if you didn't have a garden, you couldn't have a dog. Well,
right.
And then she started to look at, well, what's the scientific evidence that this has any impact on dog welfare or, you know, rehoming return rates. And basically, you know, it's, to cut a long story short, the conclusion of the work is shelters are investing a massive amount of resources on undertaking tests and screening exercises to gather information for which there is no evidence that it has any real impact either on dog welfare or return rates or anything like that. And they would be far better off spending that money on just supporting new owners and helping them integrate. Because I'm not saying some of these factors aren't important, but at the moment we just don't know. And if most shelters have got very limited resources. And this is why sort of I'm so pleased, because she literally just dropped me an email the other day to say that Maddie said they will pay for this paper to become open access, so that every shelter, everybody working for it can actually read the whole paper. But as it happens, and you know, we do not script these talks, I should point out, but I was reading actually another of your vet clinics articles. This is one from 2008. The one you did with Margaret Duxbury. And again, I really like this bit, is because you say there in 2008, pre-adoption counselling is a legitimate, valuable service to offer prospective dog owners. And again, it's that sort of, vets don't think about offering that service. You know, just the importance of just setting realistic expectations. And that's what this article is about in the vet clinics. And I guess in the video, it's going to come out as back to front, isn't it? So people can't actually read what I'm holding up. But anyway, the vet clinics of North America, and you seem to be quite a regular contributor to these special editions, but they're always so, you know, your advice is so on the nail, it's practical, it's solving real world problems.
Practical.
Yeah.
And I think it's also based on science, or based on certainly my clinical experience, and I think it's I don't know that people have the same experience. So, you know, and they assume that dogs are just going to be this way, but you know, they're not. So so that's what practical advice.
Yeah, they're practical. They're really important issues that bring about a real change. That's what I mean by being practical. Yeah, I mean, the science is good, and absolutely. I didn't want to sort of imply sort of because it was practical. No, it's good science, and it is. As you said, these chats are with people who I think are pioneering, and these sorts of, you know, the foresight to think, well, we do these tests. What does that actually mean? And it, you know, it takes somebody to actually, identify that, we're taking so much for granted, and actually we ought to perhaps test this. And by being scientific about it, you can test it. And there'll always be somebody who says, well, I knew that beforehand. And one of the first things I have to teach the students on our masters is, you know, you've got to distinguish between what you believe and what we actually know. And, you know, belief doesn't need any justification. What we know is testable. And if you suggest something that isn't testable, You know, it is, by definition, it's not scientific. Now, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but it means that you're going to probably have to agree to disagree unless you can come up with some magic argument that persuades them otherwise. Whereas in science, you're always willing to change your opinion. And the danger, I think one of the problems we have at the moment actually is people say, oh, well, you know, the science is changing, you know, my opinion is just as valuable as a scientist. No, it's not, because yours isn't based on science, if you know. Right. And that's the real crisis that we've got, is people think, well, it's all a matter of opinion. No, scientific opinion is testable. It is falsifiable. And, you know, you're entitled to your beliefs, absolutely, but please don't think that, you know, your personal opinion, if it's not backed by science, that it does have the same weight as scientific opinion. But anyway, that's one of my hobby horses at the moment. And I think it's a really important thing, because, as I said, I think in the current situation, people are confusing the two, and science is under attack. You know, the situations that we've got at the moment. I mean, the COVID crisis that is ongoing.
That's what I was thinking of as you were speaking. I said there's so many examples in the COVID crisis. So,
yeah, and it's an interesting topic which I've got quite interested in, is this whole idea of evidence-based medicine. And there are a number of problems with evidence-based medicine. It's a great idea, but when it comes to real world, actually, where does the evidence come from for evidence-based medicine? It often comes from specialist referral clinics, which aren't the front line.
Right.
So how does that actually translate? You know, that, okay, we compared these two treatments and we had super compliant people because we're working in a specialist center where, you know, we're the last issue. Well, actually, that might not translate into sort of, real world changes, whereas the sort of stuff you've been doing is very much that front line. And we've got to be cautious. And then people say, oh, well, you know, there's no research on it, so it's junk. Well, again, it's that sort of, just because we don't have evidence doesn't mean that there is evidence that's not evidence that it doesn't work. It just means we need to be doing. And I've said this with a lot of the people that I've chatted to, and I know you're the same, that, you know, you don't have to be a great scientist to do research. It's just, you know, it's a process. As I said, you've done some absolutely brilliant research, and you decided not to do the PhD. You could get a PhD by published work with all the stuff that you've done. But, you know, and, you know, I actually like trying to make science more accessible to people. It shouldn't be stuffy ivory tower stuff. It should be stuff that's out there that people can understand. And we just got to get that balance right. We've got to get, you know, the public both believing in science and also understanding what science tells us, but what it doesn't as well, and what we should do when we don't know. And again, one of the things I often say to the students is, you know, when we're dealing with clinical behavior, the question we ask ourselves is, yes, is there any evidence? If there isn't evidence, then if I'm thinking about treatments, then I have to look to see, well, are there any treatments that do have any evidence for them? In which case I should probably prefer those. But at the back of your mind should always be the important question, what are the consequences if I'm wrong in my decision? And your decision could go one of two ways. I'm going to use this or I'm not going to use this. And if you're wrong, then, you know, what are the implications? And that's the important thing to appreciate, because that's the risk assessment you've got to make. That, you know, people say, oh, well, you know, I'll use this. It'll, you know, it won't do any harm. I'll try this sort of weird treatment. And I think, well, if there are treatments that we know that work, then actually you are depriving the animal of a treatment that works. So, you know, your early work with drugs and things like that. People say, oh, well, you know, this supplement, I don't want to use drugs. Well, why don't you want to use something that we know will make the animal better? If you think the animal is so stressed that it needs a drug or something like a drug, why not go with something that you know, you know, that we have evidence for? You say, yeah, but what? You know, I just, it's sort of, we need to focus on those things. So anyway, I'm having a rant tonight.
No, I'm just yeah, and things are flashing through my brain, and I want to talk about it
Oh,
now, and
so
then but it flashes.
if you see me looking away, it's because I'm scribbling things down, by the way. So
Okay.
it's not that I'm losing interest in you. It's so that I don't forget. So tell me some of the things that have flashed into your brain while I've been ranting away.
Yeah, I want them to flash back. So because you always have so many interesting things to think about that I think about what you're talking about, and then yeah, when they flash back, I will speak.
So actually, that reminds me of something we spoke about last time that we lost, which I didn't know about, and we started to chat about it, and I'd like to chat about it
Oh,
again.
I know what I wanted to talk about.
Okay,
You might be
I'll write my notes so that I don't forget.
I,
Yeah, okay, you go.
about uh, not doing any behavior evaluations at all anymore, and the flipping the coin article, and how that came about. And
So again, just for those people who don't know, Gary Patronek wrote an article a few years ago now, just a couple of years ago, where he basically sort of said that we should stop doing shelter evaluations. They're useless. The animals are stressed. And, what is one snapshot going to tell you about what the animal's like in a home? And there's a number of logical reasons to argue for that. First of all, a snapshot is a snapshot. It's not going to tell you about the behavioral tendency. You'd need to test lots of ways. And that's why I really like your suggestion. And it's something that I've advocated for a long time, that, yeah, get the people who are working day to day with the dog to do your evaluations. And if you get multiple people to do those evaluations, you can use that as a management tool, because, if you and I are both responsible for looking after this dog in, kennel number 1, and 3 other people are, and you agree with the other 4, but I have a very different recording, then we need to ask ourselves, why do I see it as different? Is it because the dog is different? Is it because I'm perhaps not, I don't like the dog, and I've got my own biases? Is there a need for some development in me? Or is it because maybe I'm the only male and the dog doesn't like males, or something like that? And so there's so much richness in that information. And nowadays with smartphones, it's so easy to do that sort of thing. But anyway, sorry, I jumped in. You were going to talk about so we talked about the Gary article that, so he's argued that, because the dogs are stressed and because they're single tests, they're really unlikely to be predictable. So you may as well flip a coin. And we were saying, there's a lot of unnecessary resources put to things that really probably are not very useful. But I jumped in. You were going to say something.
So Gary was my boss for a period of time at the Animal Risk League of Boston, and we certainly had kind of pretty intense discussions on behavior evaluations. I was pro, and I think I'm still pro, doing some kind of evaluation, even if it's just out of the physical exam and the vaccine experience and dog walking and play groups, that there's some kind of formal observational data that you collect. And Gary, I don't think he went that far, but he felt that the behavior evaluations were stressful for the dogs, and they were a waste of time. And looking back on it, they probably did not tell us a whole lot about future behavior. However, I said to him, I don't think they're that stressful. I actually think the behavior evaluation that we did, it was an interaction with the dog that the dog probably appreciated interacting with people during the evaluation rather than being stressed out during the evaluation. But many of the evaluations that are suggested by people over the years are stressful. Our evaluations were a lot play, and walking, and so they were not as stressful as other evaluations. But so in terms of Gary looked at um, epidemiological data to look at how often you're going to find out if a dog would have a tendency to bite or did bite on the evaluation. And so since there were so few dogs that on evaluations do so, that it's not worthwhile doing evaluations. And in the big picture, looking back on it, I agree with him. I do think that we should do something to get to know the dog in terms of helping out with an adoption, and in terms of enrichment in the physical exam, the dog walking, the play groups, so which are necessary. I believe that they're necessary, and would give us some helpful information.
Yeah. But again, I think you're right. It's evaluations of the normal day-to-day rather than some of these artificial tests.
Right.
You know, the idea that you get a doll and you put it in front of a dog and that tells you how the dog is going to react to children, I find, you know, it's just ridiculous.
Yes, it is ridiculous. And
that's what, you know, that's what people hold on to. You just think, no, let's look at the dog's reaction around people. Let's get a feel for it, and maybe be more qualitative rather than try to quantify everything.
Qualitative, and I agree with you. Yes, because I was looking more when I was doing the behavior evaluations, looking at overall what the dog's personality is, rather than looking at dog-specific behavior. Like if a dog is aggressive to the toddler doll, is that dog going to be aggressive to children? No, if the dog is afraid of the toddler doll, has a fear response to the toddler doll, probably has nothing to do with children, or maybe it does. That dog might be afraid of novel stimuli.
Yeah.
And what does that say about the dog that's afraid of novel stimuli? Maybe this dog has other fears as well. Maybe this dog has more of a fearful personality. So, and that's what I was looking at, hoping to look at, but our research never got beyond that. It was starting as I left the Animal Rescue League of Boston. It was starting, but I never got beyond that because we lost our money.
It's a shame. But so one of the things that I've started to get quite interested in is the difference between what I call where you're measuring a trait versus doing a behavior profile.
Right. Yes. Right.
And
yes.
I mean, and you know, a lot of the stuff that I've done along those lines has been very much focused on traits and developing psychometric instruments, so questionnaires. Now, they're obviously of limited value when you're dealing with shelter animals.
Right.
But people like James Seppel have very much pushed. I must ask him to do one of these, actually. That reminds me.
Oh, you should,
yeah.
CBARC.
Yeah. So the CBARC, which is this long list of behaviors and circumstances. And there are some, I've got a paper at the moment that's under review. And we sort of point out that there are some potential problems, which apply also to the temperament traits as well. When you get something like CBARC and you've got a number of very specific contexts and you rate the severity of the animal's behavior in each of those contexts, let's say you've got 5 items that relate, they put together and they say, well, this tells you about aggressivity. You've got a score there. You don't know if that score is due to a low score in all the categories or a high score in one of the categories. If you think about it, if you've got 5 traits, you could score 5 because you score 1 in each of the 5, or you score the extreme response 5 in one of those. And they're very different situations. One is a very context-specific form of aggression, which you would look to manage. The other is a dog that, perhaps a little bit anxious or something like that, and therefore he's a bit uneasy and he's signaling, and that maybe not even a problem. And that's something we've got to be very careful of as scientists, I think, when we start to pool these things. So, so the behavior profile is very much about context. The trait approach, which I've tried to push down, is trying to think about what are the basic psychological traits So impulsivity, sensitivity to reward, sensitivity to aversion, frustration tolerance. And we've developed the instruments along those lines. And I must admit, now when we do the behavior consultations, if we can persuade the owner to do these temperament tests, we are 90%, if not further, towards the diagnosis just on the basis of that, usually, because we've got a nice profile of the predispositions of the animal. And then, you know, they can understand that the frustration one has been really valuable, because often people, talk about the animal being anxious, and then they've tried a desensitization program and it's not worked. And then you find out, well, actually, those signs are also potentially signs of frustration. And desensitization doesn't work terribly well for frustration. You need other techniques in order to try and manage it in that context. But anyway, so the other thing which we touched on last time in relation to shelters, before we move on to something else, the bit that got lost that you're telling me about is the group of dogs that they come out of the shelter and they're very strongly bonded to one individual, but still anxious about the bigger world.
That's my most recent interest that we were thinking about doing a little research project on. Yeah, the dogs that are adopted by, I'm dealing with one right now, by the person that rescues the dog from the shelter. The dog is seemingly friendly to that one person or people that take the dog out of the cage in the shelter and then bring the dog home, and the dog is afraid of everybody else. Is good with those people, the rescuers, but not good with anybody else. Any other family member or any unfamiliar people that come visit, or people that walk by on the street, that the dog is afraid of those other people. So,
yeah, I'm not sure. Is it in your house or my house? Somebody's clattering a load of.
It's my house. Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
He's taking the dishes out of the dishwasher.
I said, right. I actually said to my wife, "We're not putting the dishwasher on. I'm about to do a record," because I didn't want it humming in the background. But anyway, it just shows that it's real life. So sort of my thought about it was whether or not it's a little bit like a doggy form of Stockholm syndrome, where people have who've been kidnapped or whatever, and they form a very strong relationship with one individual who shows them some affection. And, again, thinking about it in the horse literature, the old traditional native North American way of breaking a horse was to drive them into quicksand, and then you'd relieve them, and then the horse would be very strongly bonded to you. The cowboy equivalent apparently was driving the horse into a grain silo and dropping tons of grain on it and pulling it out. And you certainly do see this, that I'm not saying that the animals are rationalizing it, because again, people don't rationalize it, and they don't know why they become attached to somebody who's kidnapped them in that situation. But I think, it's probably a very strong emotional response, because they form an attachment, and attachment is an emotional bond. And you can rationalize it all you like, but if you've got that strong emotional drive in something, it's very difficult to break in those situations. So I just wonder if it's in by way of sort of treatment in that situation. I wonder if sort of what we need to be doing is increasing safety and security around others, and trying to do some sort of transference along those lines, that actually you're okay with me, you can be okay with others as well. I think the main challenge will be getting the dog to actually focus on another in those situations. Do they, just out of interest, I don't suppose you've noticed whether or not those dogs also tend to develop separation related problems or anything like that? Are they at higher risk of that, do you think?
No, I haven't seen that.
No, I just
But
wonder.
you know, what's interesting, also another interesting thing, is that these dogs, we see a lot of dogs that are moved up from the South, Midwest, mostly from the South, and the dogs that are afraid of people, the other people besides the people that rescued them, um, they do better with people who have dogs. So because they're good with dogs. So if a person is in the environment that has a dog, might allow the dog owner to approach the dog. But if a person does not have a dog, it's that person is much scarier than the person that does have a dog.
Mm.
So that's another. Maybe the dog. I mean, I don't know. I think these are all things that we don't really understand how the dog is feeling. Like, let's say the dog feels these dogs are stressed out. They've been shipped up on a van from the South and they bond really closely with the person that rescues them. Do they really need another person? They don't need another person.
Yeah.
They right. They've got the food and they've got a bond and they can pee and poop outside. And do they really need more people? They don't really need more people, you know. And so,
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
understanding how the dogs are feeling and what it's like more stressful for them to try to interact with these people they don't know, and it's like too much energy to put into that than just not doing it, than keeping them away by growling at them. So these are all how the dogs are feeling and how much and why they decide not to really.
Yeah, I mean, it's all sorts of things. It could be that,
Yeah.
I've got somebody who cares for me, and I'm keeping
Right.
hold of them, and you keep away, and
That's right. Yeah. Right. It's just too much effort
why
to.
should I expand my social group any larger than this one person?
Exactly. Right. Yeah.
So that's one of the things with when we teach about the emotions, and one of the ones which we're still working with, and I need to do more thinking and work with it. And, I call it the hate system. And I sort of put the argument that actually, and I'll call it hate for the, capitals in the way like Panksepp does to distinguish it from the common use of the word hate. But if you think about it, there's an enormous amount of literature in biology literature about detecting cheats in a social group and excluding them. Animals have evolved to be able to detect people who are exploiting the social group, and they reject them, because if you have them in the group, they come at a big cost. They undermine. And that's what I mean by the origins of hate, is that actually I don't want you in my social group, because having you in my group doesn't give me the advantages of social living. It actually is a net loss. And so you would think
maybe
that, there's lots of behavioral work, but actually to put that within the context of emotion, then people start thinking, oh, you're getting too anthropomorphic. Well, emotions are there as sort of functional biological systems, and that ability to detect and have an emotional response in that way. But one of my residents, she made a good point to me. She said, well, how does that differ to frustration if you think they're taking away resources from you? I said, well, the two are very closely related, because frustration happens when, you can't get access or you're denied access to resources. The difference with hate is that the focus is not some physical barrier, it's a social barrier. And our brain has to distinguish between the social world and the physical world, because if you walk down the corridor and there's a table in the way, that if you move to the side, the table's not going to jump out to you. You can get down the corridor. If it's a person coming towards you, you have to recognize it's a person and predict their behavior. So I think a fundamental thing that our brains do is they classify the world into social things and physical things, and it makes different predictions according to that. And dog brains do that, cat brains do that, our brains do that. And therefore, when we think about the emotions, if I think that there's a barrier and it's a social barrier, then yes, it is different. It does have different properties. The way that you would solve the problems of it would be different. So I don't think it's anthropomorphic to argue that, there is an emotional system of. I'm not saying that the animal thinks about it. If you hate someone, you sit there brooding and thinking, God, that person's so annoying. I don't think that they do that sort of thing, but there is an emotional response to somebody that you don't want as part of your social group. And that might be what's going on in these dogs. As I said, it could be that they're
that's
very strongly attached.
makes a lot of sense to me. And this is the first time I've ever thought that way. So, but it does make sense to me. Yeah.
That's what I say. These that's the thing I love about these chats. They're just like the chats we would have in the bar at a conference.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I miss those. I miss them.
Yeah. Back around the
and
ideas.
I would go back to my room and I'd make little notes,
And you'd probably go off and do a great experiment about it as well, to go and test it. And that's the sort of thing that we need to do. So anyway, I'm going to just reach over because I know there's lots of things that we want to. I think we've probably covered shelters, have we? Enough?
we talked a lot. Yeah.
So, we've talked about the food aggression, and let's talk about the fatal dog attacks, because that's
the fatal dog attacks. Yes, I can explain that to you.
I have done a podcast with Jim Crosby, who now actually there's a commonality there, because you do the shelter medicine course in Florida, and actually before we leave. Well,
I do the shelter behavior course.
Shelter behavior course. So just before we leave shelters, actually, do you want to just say a little bit about that course, because that is an online course that you do remotely. I know I'm not here to sort of plug washing powders and things like this, but this is something, there's lots of people working in shelters who want to get more education, and whilst I don't know the content of the course, I would say if you have anything to do with it, it's almost certainly going to be a great course. So can you say a little bit about the course, what it teaches people, and we'll put up onto the site a link to it, so that people can get access to it and see further if they want to learn more about it.
Well, I'll start out by saying that the University of Florida has a large online education department. So, and one of the masters, they give masters and they give certificates. And one of the masters that they give is on shelter medicine. And one of the courses within the shelter medicine master's or certificate is on shelter behavior. There is an elementary shelter behavior course, and this is how you observe behavior of the animals in the shelter, how you set up problem lists, and how you set up treatment programs and enrichment for the dogs and cats in the shelter. We only do dogs and cats in the shelter. And as most recently, we have a more advanced shelter behavior course that I do not teach, but it is a continuation of the course that I teach, and it is taught by one of the people that I have taught the behavior course with, and it's more. Her name is Amy Dalrymple, and she's a shelter veterinarian, and it's more of a course using the techniques of soaping animals, and so it's along the line of for, it's not only for veterinarians, but it's problem-based observational.
Did you say soaping the animals?
Yeah. Oh, SOAP, soaping, subjective, objective, assessing, and plan. Yeah. So it's you must do that in England.
Yeah, it's not a phrase I've heard of. So
is that right?
So
Okay, I will send you
teach it. No,
information.
teach me this. People are going to listen to this and say, "Oh God, he's so ignorant." That's so well known. Subjective, objective,
Objective,
assessment,
assessment, and plan.
and plan.
You have a diagnostic plan and a treatment plan,
Oh.
and it can be applied to behavior.
Yeah.
It's mostly applied to medicine, but it is also applied to behavior.
Well, I will read about it, but it's sort of, I do teach the sort of the process of, with behavior problems, you have to go from somebody's perceptions to try and get data, which I guess is that subjective objective.
Right. Yes,
Yeah.
it is.
And then the assessment. And, so my master students are going to learn about soaping, I think. That's a new one for me.
And they also should take, they should take I give one lecture on developing a problem list and how you go from the problem list to setting up the treatment plans, the diagnostic treatment plan and the treatment plan. So now my course kind of ends there, and then Amy Dalrymple's course starts there. So she has many videos on developing problem lists and plans, and then she also has the students do a project where they look at an individual animal and goes through the whole process of developing problem lists and plans. So
just to sort of a couple of things. You don't have to be a vet to sign up for this course.
My course, no, it's for everybody.
Yeah, and you don't have to do the full masters. You could actually just do a certificate. You could
correct.
Yeah, you could do a number of the modules within that.
And the courses are, as this the shelter medicine program expands, the courses are getting better and better. In fact, I would love to take some of them right now, and I probably will. So one of the most recent courses is on the numbers when animals are in the shelter. It's very important to look at the numbers such as now my brain is blanking, associated with each individual animal, so you know how to make your judgment. Is this animal spending too much time in the shelter? Can this animal be moved on? So for the benefit of animals, looking at their numbers.
Okay. That's really good. That's
So anyway, so the course is getting better and better at the University of Florida. So I hope I don't sound like a salesperson, but it's really, this is my honest opinion of how good the course is.
But I think it's really, again, there's lots of self-styled or private courses and some of them are brilliant, but the problem with private courses is the person setting any assessments has got an interest in you succeeding. That's why I think university courses are, they're a safer bet. And it's great to know that there is that, that education out there for people if they want to do it. So thank you for that. We'll put details up on the website. Yes. If you don't send them to me, I'll go scurrying around and try and find them.
No, I will. I have it on my list of things to do for you. Pam Reed and the University of Florida.
Yeah. Well, you've just given people a preview. I'm going to go and ask Pam. I haven't spoken to Pam for ages. But I hope she doesn't say no now.
I told her what you were doing, so I would think she's going to say yes. So
good. That's good. As I said, it's been a while since I chatted to her, so it'd be lovely to catch up. So other things that I've noted here, actually, that I thought, I chatted with Vicky about, just again, the work that you did on breed identification. And I did chat at length with Vicky. But again, that important thing that what people think a dog looks like and then say, it's this type, and how that impacts on the dog's prospects as a result. And And people like Lisa Gunter have, I think, followed up on a lot of that stuff with the work she's now doing in the shelters. And shelters are just removing labels in order to help the dogs. Because
I love it. It doesn't matter. Even on my private behavior appointments, I said it really doesn't matter. The dog is who he is. The dog is a dog. And it during the time that we were looking at the breeds, identified through DNA, I came up with calling all shelter dogs American shelter dogs. These are dogs that come out of a shelter. They are American shelter dogs. They are not breed related. They're all mixed breeds, but we can say that they are shelter dogs. And around the time that I put together the American shelter dog concept, there were still only about 25% of people that got their pets from shelters. But times are changing. Now it's the in thing to do is to go to a rescue group and adopt a dog. So I would suspect that we're closer to 50%. Certainly over the years, the number one place to get from dogs were from friends and family. But I think more people are going to rescue groups now.
So we better go back to what we were going to talk about before we got sidetracked. But that's good, because we've what I try and do is, Thomas sometimes cuts it up, so we're going to have about an hour and a half talking about shelters, which I think is really good. Moving on, fatal dog attacks, because that's something that you've worked in. You worked on that case series of, I've got the notes here, what was it? 256 fatal dog attacks.
Yes.
That's scary. I mean, we probably get about 2 or 3 a year in this country. So, I would have to be 80 years old and have seen every dog attack in this country to anything like those sort of.
You don't have a Karen DeLise. You need a Karen DeLise, because she collected data on fatal dog attacks that never really made it to the papers. If you're thinking about only the fatal dog attacks that are reported in the papers and the police reports, you're probably going to see a lot fewer. But her research was remarkable. That over 10 years, she collected this data, and she interviewed the people that were involved. She interviewed the law enforcement people that collected the data, and she recorded all the information that she was able to get on each of these fatal dog attacks.
I don't know her. I can see her name's in the middle of the paper.
Yes, she is. She's the one that collected all this data.
Is she still around doing this sort of stuff, or what's she?
I don't know. I imagine she has not given it up, but the only way I would know is by asking Janice Bradley. She would know.
Yeah.
So
let's talk a little bit about that work. I mean, it's obviously a really important topic, and let's start again, perhaps with the overall findings, because the paper is about potentially preventable factors, which I think is really important. So, people tend to think, oh, well, and as I said, I did a podcast with Jim Crosby last week, and he's doing his PhD in this topic, and he's, again, going into the records in great depth, and I think it will include some of this data as well, because he certainly said Gary gave him access to all his files.
Is that right?
Yeah, or certainly to some of the
excellent.
So, but let's talk about the sort of the preventable factors and the sort of headlines of that paper. Rather than me deliver it, if you can remember. Otherwise, I will deliver it.
Well, I remember the important points.
Yeah,
I think that if you have the original papers that came out, looked at the breeds that were involved in fatal dog attacks. So this paper looked at breeds if they were identifiable and legitimate. but it also looked at other factors that could have been existing at the time of the fatal dog attack. And in reality, if you said, oh, it's these breeds are bad, we're just going to eliminate these breeds, these other factors would still be there, and there would still be fatal dog attacks, no matter if you took all the breeds away. Simple things like you have a little baby and leave the dog alone with the dog, and the dog kills the baby. You have an elderly person, and the elderly person falls over on the dog, and the elderly person cracks their head, and the elderly person dies, and that, again, no supervision is still exists, and that is really the final cause of the fatal dog attack. So there are dogs, I think it was the number of hours the dog spent time with people and the number of hours the dog was tied outside. Dogs being tied outside increases the chance of fatal dog attacks. So there are, so the high point of this paper was it was looking at other factors that led to the fatal dog attack, not just breed. And also that the breeds were not reliably identified.
Yeah.
So,
but yeah, and it's that issue of supervision is the really important thing.
Yes.
And
very
again,
important.
you know, I think this is something though that we've I think needs to be said, that, you know, in a lot of public health things, you know, one of the big predictors is socioeconomic status. But the reason why socioeconomic status is a predictive factor isn't because these people are, you know, intrinsically irresponsible or whatever. It's the fact that they're having to work 3 jobs in order to try and pay the rent because they're on such measly, you know, salaries, etc. So they have to take the risks, unfortunately, in order to survive. And I think that's, you know, and it's a much bigger statement. I you know, chatted to Carrie Westgarth, who does he's over at Liverpool, who's you know, does the epidemiology over there, and it's that, you know, factor. And I think we just need to, you know, not rush into the sort of, oh, these are just irresponsible people. Well, you know, it's a bigger statement, I think, about society and the fact that, yeah, some of the inequalities that we've got, and okay, you know, yeah, somebody shouldn't have 7 dogs and a toddler left alone. That you know, I think that's and you know, if somebody so Jim was saying about sort of people being under the influence, but the thing that he's going to be looking at, or he wants to look at, which I thought was really neat, is he wants to look at the behavior of the dogs after the bite. So where he's got video of the incident or whatever, what does the dog do afterwards, and what might that tell us about what was, you know, what the dog's motivation was, which I thought was a really fascinating area that, you know, because if we just put these dogs down and you say, well, you know, and I'm not saying that, you know, that, you know, we should be trying to save every dog, but if we just put them down, we won't learn the lessons in order to prevent. And, you know, so we should, if it's safe to do so, we need to get these animals alive and see what we can learn about it. And again, you know, it's just another great example of the sort of pioneering work that you do, that you looked at this whole topic, and yeah, and hopefully people like Jim are going to take it on further, and we'll be in a stronger position to try and prevent. And if we can prevent one fatal dog bite, you know, from all this work, it's worthwhile.
But you know, I feel like there are 25 pretty regular fatal dog attacks a year, and in the United States, and you know, the news, it just takes this and sensationalizes this information, and they don't sensationalize the millions of dogs that give us we have such good relationships with. And so I would like to not end, but to say just don't make such a big deal. It's fascinating, right? Because it's sensational, but it's not regular.
No.
It's not what normally happens.
No, absolutely.
So, yeah,
And
right.
as you're saying, getting the balance right. So, every year the hospitals produce data on actually the number of people admitted for dogs bites and strikes and stings to hospital.
Mm-hmm.
And the newspapers, almost whenever they've got a figure like that, they make it all these people are being bitten by dogs. Well,
Right.
no, actually,
Yeah.
if you trip over your dog, that comes into that category.
Yeah.
And you see the headline, dog bites costing the NHS £10 million a year.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's what makes the headline. And that's what makes the story.
That's right.
And they're trying to
Yes.
sell a story, and I understand that.
Right.
And so a few years ago, I worked with some colleagues in the business school here at Lincoln, and we started to look at the sort of economic value of companion animals, because we thought, well, if we want people to start taking things seriously, then unfortunately you have to put it into pounds, shillings and pence when it comes to government. And we used a sort of fairly well-established formula, which is based on it's well known that people who have cats and dogs are generally healthier, and therefore that saves our National Health Service a certain amount of money each year. And nobody had ever calculated the figure for the UK. So yeah, we have the headline figure, dog bites costing the NHS £10 million, dog ownership saving the NHS £2.45 billion a year. The two, I mean, and I don't want people to think, oh, well, every dog bite is is something we should be concerned about. But, don't go saying that, being anti-dog and saying it's costing our NHS 10 million when actually these people owning dogs is saving 2.45 billion a year by having cats and dogs. Let's get this in perspective, the ratio there. And maybe, what we want to be doing is promoting responsible dog ownership.
Right.
No, a dog is not for everybody. And accidents will happen. Absolutely. Owning a dog, cannot be totally risk-free. But let's put things in perspective. And if you can build a healthy relationship with your dog and do positive things, it can be good for the dog, it can be good for you, and it can be good for society as well. And there's some great work that's done in Australia where they've looked at housing developments. And if they built the housing development and they put green spaces where people could walk their dogs, what they found was those dogs were this social catalyst. And the housing development, people got to know each other, so crime rates were low because there was a community there and things like that. If you didn't have that, then within a few years these areas become fairly undesirable areas and problems. So I'm not saying the dog is the cure of everything, and you and I, we spend enough time dealing with animals with problem behavior, and it doesn't always work out. But let's get things in perspective, and let's not just go for the sensational, just for the cheap headline, and actually harm society as a result. And I think people have become too insular. That's my concern, that people don't spend enough time chatting to each other. But as you said earlier, if somebody's got a dog, you're more likely to approach them and chat to them.
Right.
But anyway, I'm very ranty tonight. I think it's probably because I spent a large chunk of yesterday recording stuff only to find that it hadn't recorded. I was like, I got students coming back.
But at least you're here the whole time. You're not freezing for half of the recording. That's very good.
It looks like it's working tonight, so that is brilliant.
And
actually, we've covered all sorts of other stuff that we didn't cover last time.
Oh, excellent!
And I've learned about soap.
Oh yes, and I will send you a really good article. I'll send it to you.
No, that's I'm learning all sorts of things, and I hope people listening in are learning things as well. So, anyway. So what else have we got here? I'm trying to think what other things we ended up chatting about last time, but we talked about the Dog Bites book. You wrote a lovely. I'm turning my head away. I've got my little pile of books here. So
Oh, right.
We talked about dog bites. So a number of years ago, myself and Carrie Westgarth, we produced this book, Dog Bites. It's not a cheap book. It's got some pretty gruesome pictures in it. I should warn people, but it is a multidisciplinary text, and it just seemed to be this big gap in our sort of field that nobody should have a monopoly on it. So we've got medics, we've got vets, etc. And you wrote a lovely review. So I have to say thank you for writing that review.
Oh, my pleasure. I wish I had written an article.
I think I did ask you, but you were busy.
You did.
I don't think you were very well. And again,
No, I was fine. It was.
You were just being mean to me.
No, not to you. No. It was. I think that that's when I was very involved in the National Canine Research Council, and we thought maybe it wasn't going to be a very good book, and then it turned out to be a really good book. So that's a
shame. That's a shame because
that was a shame.
Yeah.
So then I wrote the review, which I thought was like a nice a nice thing for me to do. So
you did. You did.
Yeah.
It is a shame you didn't contribute to chapter, because it would have been a richer text for it. Mm-hmm. And it's a shame, but I guess that's something that goes on a lot in sort of America.
In the world.
You mentioned the but the National Canine Research Council, who they're very cautious. I have had chats with them, and they're lovely people, but people are afraid to talk about certain things at times because they're worried that it's going to get misrepresented. And I guess I'm the complete opposite. I'll talk about anything to anyone, and I
think you probably asked me to write the article on evaluations.
Yeah. I think on the basis of the paper that you.
Yeah, and I think maybe that was the time that that they were starting to recommend not to do evaluations. So I think it was a little hot time.
Yeah.
So
maybe that's what we should be saying there, but So anyway. It is what it is. As I said, the book's there. It's a good starting point.
It's a very good book. Yeah.
And if anybody is interested in the issue of dog bites, it's an academic starting point, and there's still so much to be done in that area. But okay, so that's my plug for tonight. So I think we're probably just about there, actually.
I think this went very well.
I think it's been really nice. And well, actually, there is one thing which I know we touched on it last time, and I this is sort of that morbid side of me. I'm aware that you've had MS for a long time, and and I think it's even more remarkable when I think about everything that you've done, and coping with the MS, etc. And I'm pleased that you're still in generally pretty good spirits, and well, you're always in good spirits, being you're pretty mobile still, etc. And again, I think that's a really inspirational thing for people, that you're a great example of, even with the chronic health issues, that you keep going, you keep doing great work, and focus on the positive. And that's why I like chatting to you.
So well, I think, right. I think that I almost think that's what you have to do. You could just dig yourself a hole and cover your head, but boy, why stay alive? I mean, I get all of these apparatuses so that I can keep being active, and but I do. I'm pretty creative, so that I've been creative throughout my whole life, and what I've ended up doing. So, and I'm doing the same thing with MS. Yeah. It's not a great thing to have, but it's not stopping me. So
no, it's great. And actually, last time we spoke, you were just about to order a foldable kayak.
Yeah, we went out once. We only had a chance to go out once.
How was it?
Because the weather it's a fantastic boat. It's like it It's a little bit of a pain in the neck to unfold it, but it took Effie about 15 minutes to unfold it. But once it got on the water, it's a real boat. It's
Mm.
like it's actually a good boat. It's not like one of these inflatable things.
I've got
It's
an
a
inflatable one.
nice,
Don't mock it. I like my inflatable kayak.
but this one goes fast. We
Okay.
went actually faster than Effie's sister, who was in a regular kayak.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, so it's a nice boat. So
Okay.
yeah, so next season we will be kayaking more. It's just getting a little bit chilly here.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, I hope it won't be too long before I get to catch up with you. I mean, it'd be nice
Yes.
to be able to chat with you, as I say, for twice in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, right.
And
So
catch up on all sorts of things. But
yeah.
I just want to sort of finish by saying thank you so much just
Well,
for
thank
this
you.
evening. But also, as I said, the thing I love about doing these podcasts is I'm chatting to people who I'm very fond of, but have been so important to me. And I've probably never sort of got round to saying that to people. And actually, here's another morbid story to end with. I can remember when I was a student, I think it was in my fourth year, and I just thought, actually, I'm incredibly lucky. And my parents, I didn't necessarily have always the greatest seeing eye to eye with my dad, like most teenage males, I guess. But it dawned on me, you know what? I've been incredibly lucky compared to a lot of people, and so I thought I'm just going to say thank you to my parents. So in those days, you actually wrote real letters, and I wrote a letter to my parents, and so. I'm writing this because I've realized just how lucky I am to have you, that you love me, and da 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 da. Well, I post the letter. 2 days later, obviously, the letter arrives about 8:30. I get a phone call. I think I'm about to top myself, to kill myself. So this is my goodbye letter to them.
What?
It's just not like me to say thank you to people. So anyway, this is not my goodbye to the world.
Oh,
But on
hope
that,
not. That would be awful.
so on that happy note, I just want to say thank you for everything. It's been lovely to chat to you this evening.
And thank you.
And as I said, for all the work you've done, and I hope people listening to this enjoy it and find inspiration in it. So thanks once again, Amy.
Well,
Amy
thank you so
Marder,
much.
thank you so much. Okay.
Okay, thank
Cheers
you.
then.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.